Boa tarde, good evening if you are in Europe. My name is José Luis Passos. I direct the Center for Brazilian Studies at UCLA. I am a faculty member in the Spanish and Portuguese department. And on behalf of Cindy Fan, the Vice Provost for International Studies and Global Engagement, Chris Erickson, Senior Associate Vice Provost and Director of the International Institute, Kevin Terraciano, Director of the Latin American Institute, and Bonnie Taub, Associate Director of the Latin American Institute, as well as Rosina Becerra, Chair of the Spanish and Portuguese Department. I would like to welcome you to the last unfinished page of Genesis, Amazonian Apocalypse or Reinvention, a presentation by Professor Susanna Hecht, followed by a discussion. This will be, I hope, a very informal webinar, and Susanna is a colleague, has been a colleague for many years. I've known her actually for longer than that, for over 20 years. I was a grad student here, and I've read her work, I've taught her work, and even though we are in separate departments, separate units, or on campus, separate divisions, I'm a huge admirer of her, and our research agendas have overlapped in the past, but we have never really talked. Now, the idea for this meeting is to start a conversation featuring Susanna's work and research, and engage junior scholars, advanced PhD students, and guests, and see if we can develop new research agendas and use Susanna's work as a source. So she has kindly agreed to make a presentation today and hopefully start a tradition of sharing our or featuring our Brazilianness research and publications as part of the regular event series, or the Colloquium on Brazil series, organized by the Center for Brazilian Studies and the Latin American Institute. With me, I have Brian Pitts, Associate Director of the Latin American Institute, who has been helping me to put this together and coordinate all events related to the Center for Brazilian Studies. I also have Benjamin Burt and Barbara Galindo, whose work intersect with Susanna, and I'll introduce them in a minute. I'll say a few words about Susanna. She is extremely prolific, and her CV and bios are very long for me to go over in detail, but she's professor of urban planning. Her research focuses on the intersections of economies, cultures, and land use, and the socio-environmental effects of these processes, an approach now known as political ecology. Her focus is the Latin American tropics, and more specifically Amazonia. Her research has implications for understanding the dynamics of land use change and what they imply about human relations with nature, economies, and tropical development. Her work has forged new understandings of the social lives of forests as part of environmental history, as well as current practices. She has also done work on indigenous anthropocenic soils, the impacts of migration on forests and land use, and the livestock sector. Her work on forests are explored in two of her edited or co-edited books on the ideologies, environmental histories, and current practices and processes that produce forests, in addition to, in a different volume, exploring questions of migration, resources, and rural livelihoods. Recently, her research has focused on historical ecology and environmental economics. Her books, The Scramble for the Amazon and The Lost Paradise of Euclides da Cunha, won the American Historical Association's Best Book in Environmental History award in 2015. And her earlier volume, Fate of the Forest, also won multiple awards. Susanna's work has been funded by the NSF, NASA, MacArthur Foundation, ACLS, Guggenheim, Ford Foundation, Hewlett Foundation, National Geographic Society, and many other sources. She's a member of Princeton's Institute for Advanced Study, and holds a professorial appointment at the Graduate Institute for Development Studies in Geneva. So as you can see, I am very proud of this colleague and of sharing a little bit of the campus life with her. So I will introduce our discussants once Susanna is done with her presentation, and now I invite Susanna to start with her talk. Once again, welcome to the Colloquium in Brazil, and thank you so much, Susanna, to be here with us.
Well, first of all, I'm delighted to be here. I'm just checking to see if I'm muted. You know, there's always that horror when you start yapping away and then someone says, "You're on mute still." So I'm just checking with that. So I'm not muted. It is an honor to be here. I also think that the Latin American studies has been such a rich place in terms of its colleagues and in terms of its intellectual diversity and focus that it's quite a delight to be able to do this with my colleagues. And I really look forward to even more of these colloquia because they're so interesting. And I wish we've been having quite a few of them. Not all of them have I been able to go to, but the ones that I have been to have been extraordinarily interesting. So one of the things I think is really important, and it's where Jose and I intersect, is actually in the issues of the environmental humanities. And, you know, one of the things about Euclides da Cunha is that he is, of course, most known for Os Sertões. Now, the Sertões really, at that time, meant all the way into the backlands and could have included Amazonia. And indeed, and when he was thinking about his own writings on Amazonia, and it's also important to realize that he spent more time in Amazonia than the few weeks he did in Os Sertões. And he meant for his Paraíso Perdida to be a sequel because it sort of represented the triumph of those who had been so beaten down and ended up in many ways as refugees into the Amazonian rubber ecologies. So he actually is more of an Amazonist than he is given credit for. And I always say everybody stops at Canudos, but they should just keep going on with Euclides, and you'll find this extraordinary world that he reviewed and wrote about, to my mind, better than anyone. I'm going to go to my share screen now, but I wanted to say that, first of all, I'm sort of presenting some of my work in progress. I'm working, if Scramble was about the rubber period and the geopolitics of the 18th and 19th century and early 20th century, and Fate of the Forest was another phase of nation building under the dictators and the authoritarian period. This book, which I'm just stealing from Euclides, which I want to call, I've sort of used it as my title for this talk, which is about the last unfinished page of Genesis. And I think it's very provocative in the sense that on one level, we sort of think of Amazonia as this fecund place where all sorts of biodiversity is constantly being created, and that's true. But it's also in a situation, so we can imagine the last unfinished page as being a sort of evolutionary progress going forward with, you know, this expansive set of richness. But the other thing is, of course, it's a place that's highly threatened. So the last unfinished page of Genesis might be perhaps a bit more apocalyptic, or at least more disturbing than we might imagine. And Euclides, I think, always gives you a chance to do double interpretations and double takes. You never really know what he permits, and it's sort of expansive thinking. And so in this case, what we want to think about with him is really, what's it going to be? You know, is it going to be, you know, the even more diverse, more complex, more interesting, or is it going to be maybe gone? So in this sense, I want to talk about some of the dynamics that we now see. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go and share my screen if I'm allowed to do this. Hold on here. I don't know why I'm not sharing my screen. Hold on. It should come up. I do this. I teach all the time, so I want to exit minimized. Let's see. Since we're doing this this is Zoom, right? So it shouldn't be a problem. Let me up. Ah, here we go. I just needed to get, all right, I'm going to share my screen now and off we go. So share, and someone has to say, yes, we can see your,
Yes, we can see.
screen.
Everything looks
Because,
good.
because you know how awful that is when you start blabbing away. And then there's that horrible moment when you realize that you're showing a blank screen. Well, this is, of course, Euclides da Cunha in a sort of represented painting that has both the sort of images of the Canudos as well as clearly the tropical world behind him. And one of the things he did is he traveled along the Purus River, which I'll tell you more about. But this sort of caterpillar represents this sort of every one of these is a rubber port or a wooding station. The difference here is the line between the Brazilian occupation, and here you have the caucheros of Peru. So he was there as part of a border thing, a border negotiation, and had to sort of talk about a world that he knew nothing about, and most people didn't know anything about, but which basically was about the question of the borders between Brazil and Peru, and in a certain sense, the political futures of the Amazon. The other thing he pointed to, though, was that in this case was Castilla, not the Hevea seringa, which was the Brazilian latex, which had to be deforested in order to produce the latex that was so highly prized, and without which we wouldn't even have had the Industrial Revolution. So this gives you a sort of forest sense of the world. But just to go back for a minute, what he was talking about when he was talking about the rubber, the Peruvian tappers of Castilla, was that they were builders of ruins, that basically they exploited the forest, they exploited people, and left nothing in their wake. Whereas he had a kind of imaginary of small farmers and complex systems within a little bit imaginary, but not entirely so, in the Hevea system of Brazil. So he had sort of imagined this as a kind of yeoman frontier versus a frontier of plunder. So in that sense, he already kind of prefigures some of the questions that we'd like to maybe confront now. Well, this is a rich forest, you know, in fact, this is a completely humanized forest. And the reason I show it is that if you passed by as a European or anybody in the 16th century, you would have said, looks like just some forest to me. When in fact, if you were an Amazonian, you would say, boy, that looks like a great acai forest with all its secondary things, including castaña and cacao and all sorts of things. So one of the things is that there are a couple of different kinds of imaginaries about forests. Well, today we also are confronting builders of ruins, and plunder economies of multiple kinds. And in this case, one of the things that we're seeing is, of course, massive deforestation. I'm sure you were following, well, maybe not, but of course I remain riveted to the deforestation literature as it comes out in the fall. And also I follow commodity markets in a way that I never thought I would. But the point is that you're seeing really large scale transformation of landscapes from these forested landscapes into cattle landscapes and soy. And so the questions that I'm really posing here are sort of the questions of modern history here about what's going on. And why it is that we are now, after a decade and a half of really controlling deforestation, why we're in such an explosive moment. Well, part of it is that we're in the midst of a natural experiment about what happens when you have environmental regulation and social engagement in livelihoods and conservation that produces those lovely forests that I just showed you, or when you take all the regulation off and support those who prefer to produce commodities. Also, the question that we have to ask is, are we looking at a development failure, really, in the sense that while we may be seeing an explosion in extractive economies in the sense of both mineral and agrarian extraction, that is export-led development, with minimal investment in other manufacturing and other kinds of development programs that we might imagine. And is Amazonia the kind of important last resort for a kind of development failure? Will we see, is this really the last unfinished page of Genesis? And as I said, what does that mean? And what are the kinds of contours of a future? Is it a bioeconomy? Would it be something like decolonizing the Amazon? Because basically it generates more than $100 billion of wealth every year, if you, not just the Brazilian, and if you take in the whole thing, and the oil economies and the coca economies. And so you're looking at a place that's generating massive wealth, but in which there's very little investment in its populations and in its regeneration. So what I'd want to do is basically give you some quick history explaining the decline in clearing, why it dropped for a while, and also if you dropped clearing in the past, perhaps one can do so now, and why it's exploding now. And then also the question of tipping points, because I think we can look at this as sort of an economic history, but there's also a very powerful political ecology going on, and that ecologies don't necessarily, or can be disobedient. That is, this is not a sort of place on which human history tout court can be written, that it's a complex situation, a complex ecology. And as Bruno Latour would put it, Amazonia is itself an actant. It is an actor in its history. It's not just a surface on which humans write their desires. Well, okay, so I said there was a lot of deforestation. The world here begins in 1988, so that's right at the end of Fate of the Forest. But we'll go back a little further because there's been extraordinary research on Amazonian prehistory. But what you can see is that Amazonian deforestation bounces around a little bit. But in general, it's been, and if you start in 1960, it's very low, and we go into these very high levels of annual deforestation. And then from 2004 to about 2014, well, we can take 2012, it drops by 80%. Now, that's an extraordinary amount of deforestation to have decline in a short amount of time. There's a lot of things that go on there. It's not just regulation, but a lot of it is. So it's important to realize that there was this capacity to contract what looked like a continuing exponential dynamic, and to contract it into a really minimal level of clearing. But now, of course, what you see is that we're on the way up, and every year is getting worse and worse. So let me go to my next slide. I mentioned that there's a lot of history about Amazonia, and the archaeologists and ethnographers have been really animating this research a lot, and it has a lot of implications. First of all, Amazonia's, the reason it has implications is that these kinds of knowledge systems and practices, and revising the population to levels so that it actually looks like it was about as inhabited as almost any place on the planet at 500 years ago, gives us a chance to think about what an adaptive and adapted set of systems might look like in Amazonia, and could these be a kind of a future platform? Well, first of all, it's been inhabited for a long time, 14,000 years. And during that time, it was not inhabited by people who were only ran around naked and painted themselves red. This was a civilizational realm. So one of the things that I always sort of complain about is that European and Middle Eastern models of settlement, domestication, urbanization really don't fit the tropics that well. We have the habit of slapping these paradigms on, but Amazonia has been breaking paradigms from the beginning. If you want to think about its role in European science, there's wonderful literature that looks at how much the tropics were changed, how Europeans thought about their own science as well, instead of referencing back to Aristotle. The other thing is it's tropical, it's super diverse, it has really high net productivity, which means that it just cranks out a lot of biomass and energy all the time. It's hyper diverse, it's a very dynamic environment. Amazonian rivers go up and down by 12 meters, and they're huge water systems of wetlands. So we don't really, Euclides often described the rivers of Europe as those puny rivers, would barely be called creeks in Amazonia, and that's quite true. The other thing is the place is at least as culturally diverse. It doesn't have any winters, so those systems don't shut down in the same way. And as I mentioned before, these are old ecosystems and they're old socio-environments. One of the things that people have been noting and working on lately is that there's been extensive terraforming. That is, these were engineering cultures. You may have seen in the New York Times, the Hohokia round area, the round circle, the ring ditch. It was sort of like looking at what we in Amazonia call geoglyphs, but they're ring ditch structures that are almost perfect. Also, extensive domestication of landscapes. So we have a model of domestication that you just domesticate a plant or an animal. What you have in the Amazonian context is domesticated landscapes, that the landscape itself is doing a lot of work. It's sort of a little pet in a way. You sort of play with it and do things with it, but it is also a generative thing on its own. So as I say, we don't have that binary domestication and wild. You have this domesticated landscape that has domesticated plants, as well as a kind of, a range of degrees of domestication and wildness. So the idea here is that they're reciprocal landscapes, that you do things and the landscape does things for you. The other thing are those anthropogenic dark earths, that's ADEs, the Terra Preta, and it's important here to recognize that this is a technological equivalent to irrigation in terraces. Amazonian soils and Amazonian ecosystems are very old, and the soils themselves are not very good. In fact, they were considered so terrible that you could have never developed complex civilizations because the soils were so crummy. You could never get a surplus, and thus you could never evolve beyond a rather charming in its way, yet somehow primitive sets of cultures that were semi-sedentary and semi-nomadic and not really what you would look at as true civilizations. So what one of the things that I actually worked on in quite a while ago was actually looking at the formation of Terra Preta. Let me explain why I think it's so important, and also why now this literature on Terra Pretas and Terra Mulatas is reconfiguring Amazonian history. One is, Amazonian soils are a very serious constraint. Empirically, that's the case if you don't do anything with them. But you could also think about terraces, that is agriculture on mountain landscapes, that without terraces, you wouldn't really be able to colonize these areas very effectively or for very long. Now, with terraces, of course, somehow you manage to be able to generate complex civilizations, empires, and so on throughout the tropics. So think about Asia, but also no reason not to think about the Andean civilizations and, of course, Central American as well. So terraces are one way you get around a really serious soil constraint. Another one is irrigation, and I'm speaking to you from from an irrigated landscape, which is Los Angeles. But if you think about irrigation and not having enough water, that also is a really profound constraint to both agriculture and to civilization, you would think. But in fact, of course, the irrigated civilizations of the Middle East, of Europe, and the current use of irrigation in the American Southwest would sort of argue that you can get around that constraint if you know how to use technologies that are invented for that thing. So the Terra Preta really is on a par with these technological equivalents in terms of its ability to increase the productive capacity. So what this does, along with other work on domestication of landscapes and the complexity of the production systems, is gives rise to the idea of an anthropogenic Amazon, an Amazon whose complexity and ecological riches we marvel at, but one which also has extraordinary human support for human capacity for human support. So let me just show you a few other technologies. I mentioned Terra Preta because it's the one I know best, but these are the raised fields of the Beni. I should have also put in some of the mounds of the Beni, which are also Terra Preta and other kinds of things. But this white thing in the middle is a road. And the rest of it is Alto Beni geophysical constructions, raised bed constructions, so that these areas remain productive when these savannas are flooded, and also that you can stay on top of them, and also that they have fish weirs and fish ponds built into them. So in a certain sense, what you see is an extraordinary amount of terraforming. This is a map of Terra Preta, of main Terra Preta sites. It used to be thought that these maybe occurred mainly along the big tributaries and so on. But in fact, what you can see is that they're all over the place. And we've just put in the ones here that pertain to the Brazilian Amazon, but there's lots of them all over the place. In fact, it's quite ubiquitous. So the point here is that you can see that this also represents a fairly substantial amount of terraforming and a human modification of such a point that it could be significant for a kind of imperial Amazon. Another very famous form of geoengineering are these, we call them geoglyphs, but they are what are called raised ring ditches. Some of them represent ceremonial areas. Others could, the meaning of them is mysterious. Also, there are important orientations of these and connections with causeways. Again, this is a modern road, but what you can see also is the geometric clarity and carefulness in all of these, so that again, these were very advanced engineering societies. So we need to be thinking of these not as just people who sort of march around the forest and harvest this and that, but rather as complex organized societies. And once you start to do that, then of course you can imagine a kind of imperial Arawaks going all the way up to Florida, which in fact they did, and that the Caribbean really represents, and the Atlantic coast of much of Middle America are actually kind of Arawak outposts. And of course, the connections between Amazonia and the Andean world were much more extensive than sometimes we realize. So you have to sort of realize a land in motion and a civilization in change. So they have perhaps a different style that we might not view as particularly as looking perhaps a little bit primitive, but I think this is not the case. And now that tattooing is part of all the rage, this kind of body painting seems less odd to us than it might have at other times. But the point here is that these are some of the elders, and these are in essence the cohort of Kayapo, in this case, scientists. All right, so we have this prehistory that has created this very complex and interesting landscape. We know that it's being deforested very radically. And as I say, the world starts in 1988, but it's a key year for a number of reasons. One is that it really marks the change of from into the new constitution and a shift from the authoritarian period into a more democratic set of political regimes. It also indicates the incentive in a kind of new form of globalized frameworks. Now, it's not that Amazonia or the Amazonian countries were outside of global frameworks. After all, they were key players and key objects of the Cold War politics. But what happens is a new set of frameworks comes into play. These include the ascendance of human rights in development politics. The other thing that's particularly important here is environmental politics as a regional and global enterprise. So while before we might have thought about a national park here in the United States, but the real expansion of environmentalism as such, as a global process, really starts to emerge at this time. There were these environmental things and human rights things could become financial levers, so that states had to be a little more careful about them. And as I mentioned, it also was the end of a lot of authoritarian regimes, or is kind of a mark of transition. And also it's a moment in which the internal ISI model of autarkic economies, highly centralized and mainly industrial focus, is sort of turned over through the Washington Consensus. Decentralization, open economies, rise of the neoliberal, and but the open economies and restructuring of these economies, privatization and so on, become its hallmarks. The other thing that's particularly important was that in that new constitution, you had the recognition of historical rights of traditional populations, and not just of indigenous groups, but quilombolas, former Afro-descendant communities, river-based communities, non-timber forest extractors, and so on. So it contained within it the idea of multiple modernities, so that you could be a person living in the modern world, but within a complex way of being in it instead of the uniformity. I put this up because this is the Kaya poet with whom I worked at the Constitutional Convention in 1988, and I thought I'd put that of the American. And I wanted to point out that there were a lot of headdresses here. These are called wigs in our language. And these crowns worn by the Kayapo, of course, are, in my view, far more magnificent. Also, a kind of uniformity in output, in outfit, and we see that here too. So the point is that I find this a kind of unusual and interesting comparison, and there's no reason to take this set of questions less serious, and this set of forefathers, so to speak, less seriously than these. So again, this question of land rights and historic claims, but also there were new forms of institutions that were triggered, and also a new array of civil society and state institutions. Some built on traditions, others were novel, some were local, regional, others were globalized. But really what was the important epistemic change here was that inhabited forests had conservation values. Also, they were looking at science-inflected development, and also a shift from sort of that natural history thing and into the remote sensing and big science. Also, this period hits the rise of climate change science. The IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, is developed in 1988. You get the idea of environmental services and environmental and ecological economics. So what this means is that you have the capacity for really quite a bit of rethinking about and playing around with ideas of nature. Well, I've I've already said most of this, but I will begin with this. Also, not only did the IPCC, but 1988, the internet's developed. But also China moves into international realms. It begins with those open borders and less tariffs. You get in South America a China shock like you had here, which is it essentially floods out with its well-manufactured and cheap manufacturers and high quality ones. It sort of undermines the manufacturing sectors of much of Latin America. Well, one of the things, I've sort of gone over this already, but one of the things I want to emphasize are my last 2 points here, which is that one of the outcomes of these epistemic changes was the idea of socio-environmentalism. That is, this is so different from the points of environmentalism that were elaborated, particularly in the United States, which saw environment as sort of an external thing, and saw environmentalism per se as a kind of conservation exercise in which people had to be excluded, versus one that sees environments as being social frameworks, as being social history, part of the writing of social history. The other thing I want to emphasize is that these modern institutionalities are really young and they're quite fragile. So it's important to realize that, you know, the 90s is when most of these institutionalities come into play. So we're looking really at kind of a very recent set of institutions, ideas, and it's not that these were uncontested. So I'm going to say a few things about sort of how this was playing out at the national level. You had a lot of new institutions. You had new environmental laws. You also had the emergence of global markets like payment for environmental services. So this is the economic dynamics here, and reduce, you know, payments for reduced emissions from deforestation and degradation. You had a lot more attention to supply-based stuff like ecological and agroecological markets. Those of us who work in Los Angeles find acai bowl corners in lots of places I don't know whether they're money laundering, but that it is it's widely available, and it's sort of like chocolate and coffee, widely and easily available. But it comes out of an agroecological market. You also see the extension of social movements and NGOs articulating with the state. You start to get new kinds of pacts between producer pacts and export markets, producer pacts and national markets, and the emergence of the question of supply chains. In addition, not only do you get the idea of a new episteme, but you also get new kinds of property regimes that are elaborated around them, and new kinds of what are called protected areas and conservation types. So you have these ideas, and then they're materialized. And all of this ensemble of environmental markets, green markets, new kinds of regimes and pacts gives us the idea of green governance for the tropics. So you start to have like a kind of exciting shift in what comes on. The economics, as I mentioned, involve green crops, the shift into niche crops, boycotts, the transparency of commodity chains, and so on. But while this is all going on and there's a sort of nice green story, in the meantime, because of the sort of failure of the other models of development, what you have is a kind of emergence here of a lot of new infrastructure, taking advantage of global commodity booms, the very intense demand from China. China starts to become the main trading partner. In this infrastructure development, you also get a lot of speculative economies and so on. So one of the things is that while we get this extraordinary decline in deforestation, the stuff is in place for this part of the expansion of clearing. Well, as I say, what happens is that it looks like you're going to get big paradigm shifts here that are giving us, you're getting increased production here, in this case, in agricultural, in terms of billions of reais. You're getting mobilization of civil society. You're getting monitoring of deforestation. You're getting legal designation and the idea of zero deforestation commodities. So what happens is that it looks like you're going to have this major shift, which will be both producing standing forests and valuable commodities, and a lot of them. The other thing is that you have a lot of expansion of protected areas. Again, you're having enforcement, you're blacklisting top deforesters because you can tell where they are and who they are. And then, of course, the soy moratorium. So it's really what happens is that it produces this map. This is a map that has all these different forms of protected areas at different levels of protection. But the point is that all of the extraordinary, both the speed and the thoroughness with which the Amazonian map was transformed from being a kind of an open commons into being a place in which both an ecological form of development might unfold, as well as one that was equitable and socially just. Next, oh, there's another. Well, here's that forest again. But as they say, there's trouble in paradise. First of all, as you might recall, for those of you who are Brazilian specialists, the rise of what's called the Banca Ruralista, the agro-industrials, began to be really kind of irritated with this environmental regulation stuff. And she's impeached, and the vice president, who is quite corrupt and needs to stay in power, then begins to fall into line. So you have that. You have a generalized, more broadly, there's in the movement for a number of different reasons across the Amazon, the Pan-Amazonia, you're getting moving into a complex, somewhat generalized authoritarian, and the problem of flailing states. That is, they have to deal with their own political schemes, and so they don't really look at Amazonia too much. I've mentioned the failure of development policies and other parts of the economy, increased precarity, multi-sided income strategies, and highly supported now sectors that, let me go back, highly supported export sectors. And, we begin to see, as I say, this problem of failing states. In all of this, Amazon starts to become very important because of the dependence on Amazonian economies, the China shock, and the rise of China as a central trader. And you can really see this in this particular graph, which gives you an idea of the importance of China in these commodity markets. And in this case, this is for soy, but it's for pretty much all Amazonian commodities. Well, one of the problems here, and I'm using something from Oaxaca, which is the rise of transgenic soy and its expansion, it's kind of the lead. While livestock takes over lots of areas, this becomes sort of the economic lance of the region in a lot of ways. And again, you can sort of see this large scale transformation. Again, what you're seeing here, I'm sorry I keep putting this up, but it's important that you keep seeing how very rapidly the change is occurring and some of these drivers. There's also a dynamics of leakage across other systems. Because we're running out of time, I'm not going to go into it too much, but I do want to make a couple of points. One is that there's a lot of investment in unproductive but unprofitable dynamic speculation ahead of the regional development process, what we might call prolepsis. Under conditions of COVID, we get declines in regulations and no implementation of regulations. A lot of speculative economies and also a lot of clandestine economies of gold, timber, coca, and land grabbing. So what happens then is we begin to get, and also the main thing that becomes valued is the foreign exchange value of Amazonian commodities and not the ecological and social value of these resources. So you can see part of the problem is that there's leakage, that part of that deforestation decline reflects a kind of flight into non-regulated, much less regulated environments. This is the Cerrado. You can see that's also undergoing massive deforestation. There's a lot of deforestation in Bolivia at the same time. Again, we see that this is soy is one of the central drivers, as well as the idea of amnesty, so that if you clear, there's no problem. You're not a criminal. You're not committing an environmental crime. You are basically a developer. And then this is the Chaco of Argentina, and here also natural forest at tremendous scale is being converted into soy. So it's not nothing that's going on. The scale and the rapidity that's going on is quite extraordinary. One of the things that you see, of course, with the election of Bolsonaro in 2018 is that he comes into play and he says no more demarcation of native, indigenous, or traditional or conservation lands, that's over. He puts indigenous lands under a new management, and this is, of course, to inhibit demarcation and declaration, and also, if possible, to evangelize them. It takes on an assimilationist indigenous policy. There's degazetting of conservation areas. If there was deforestation on them, then they're no longer conservation areas, and there's amnesty for the clears. Environmental budgets are cut. He's for privatization of agricultural research and privatization of forest monitoring, and he puts the Amazon under military rule. So it's kind of a big shift from this sort of realm of civil society and a kind of explosive and creative and innovative set of thinking about Amazonia into a kind of, how shall we say, an authoritarian modernism, primarily based on GMOs of many different sorts and uniformity of landscape. There is more. There's a movement now, I'm not sure whether it's been completed, in favor of promoting mining on native lands. The Secretary of State, of course, was recently resigned, but he was a climate denier. Attacks on NGOs as agents of foreign states, flees the human rights accords, defunds a lot of government agencies, continuing verbal attacks, creating an environment of violence, impunity, and amnesty for environmental crimes. The abandonment of alternative modernities in favor of agro-industrial and mining interests, the sort of agrarian extractivisms and mineral extractivism. Again, we also have privatization of the financial levels and an explosion in formal and informal roads then other infrastructures that become very important triggers of deforestation. So let me go through some of this stuff and what it means and what it meant last year. Basically, fire activity has been significantly up. In the southern Brazilian Amazon, deforestation activity increased by 23%. And understory fires were 60% higher than in 2019. One of the things that's and so you can see here what happens, which is that as you get a lot of these roads that are built in off of these colonization areas and then they become cleared, there's also a great deal of land speculation around this. You can see how the rate of let me go back here, the rate of land use change over time. So there's a lot of deforestation going on. It's close to 20% of the region now. Another thing is that what's called understory fires are now basically equal to, and in many cases greater than formal deforestation. So part of that is maybe preparation for later deforestation, but the other thing is that forests escape in and also increase the vulnerability. So I'm going to go to my next slide, which is the same thing. And the red lines are deforestation. You can see how much understory burning there is. And so there's some small clearing and there's some existing grasslands. Those are pastures because this area is a forested area. Indigenous Kayapo territories and so on, protected areas. You can see how things are coming under attack here. And in my next slide, I basically show you how much of the illegal gold is going, how much illegal gold mining is going on. These are these garimpos, which given the sort of economic problems of the last years, this becomes a very important area of environment, of economic support, at least part-time for many of the populations. But what you want to see is that there is a lot of invasion of protected areas and indigenous areas by gold mining. So so there's a lot of, how shall we say, semi-visible. I'm going to go back to my previous slide. There's a lot of deforestation and environmental degradation that you might not see just if it wasn't just clearing. You might not see it if you're just looking at the landscape. What we have now, as I mentioned, is this visible infrared imaging radiometer that detects heat. So this is sort of changing the game for being able to see through the canopy. So last year, there were about 600,000 individual fire events. And what you could see is that there was really a lot of very large forests, basically on a par with the size of the largest forests that we had here in California. So one of the things that's important to realize is that we're seeing really a lot of change and a lot of burning in these areas and a lot of destruction that comes with that. Also, I saw this last week. You can buy illegally cleared land on Facebook. So if you want, you can basically they'll give you the GPS location, and there you go. If it's cleared, you get a much higher asking price, and there you are. So just so you know that social media isn't just about denigrating forest peoples, but it's also about commerce. You'll be amazed to hear. Anyway, this is more of that, but the point is so that you can see how extensive this burning is and how extensive this change is. And the areas that aren't really burning these are largely indigenous areas. So it's important to realize that when they say they're forest guardians, they're not kidding, but also that they're being nibbled, the edges are being nibbled at by other land uses. Why is this important? Well, one is atmospheric rivers. Amazonia sort of creates its own weather because it evapotranspires. It goes up into the air, it's pushed over to the Andes, and it creates these big atmospheric rivers that are central to the rain-fed agriculture of Brazil and also the water supply of the megacities of Rio de Janeiro and Sao Paulo. It also means that these regional the internal hydrological cycle is being disrupted. So you're changing microclimates, we're having increased drought, forest recovery is weaker, variability in rainfall timing, as I mentioned, atmospheric flows. And remember, this is an area that's doing a lot of damming. So it has a lot of impacts on river flows so that the infrastructure may be responding to a climate and river flows that no longer exist. The other thing is this problem of emergent, I think I need to go back here. Yes, one is this problem of tipping points, which is if you get a little bit further into these changes that I just mentioned, these emergent points, you get a shift into savannization of Amazonia. So if you look at the sort of similar rock formation in a rainforest area, it looks like this. the similar one in a non-rainforest area, the savanna formation, looks like that. So we may be swapping out this for that. Let me go on to my next one. There are other emergent properties and problems. One, there's problems with the carbon economy. Amazonia may be now more an emitter than a carbon sink and carbon absorber. There's issue of white sand forests. These are peat forests. These are like the Indonesian forests. They have peat soils, poor resilience, and they emit carbon like anything. The other thing is that in this process, so you have two sort of carbon issues, but exactly the areas where you have not very much land that's been allocated or in any kind of conservation thing. These are also in the sites of the Amazonian Belt and Road system and sort of ripe for immense land grabs. So the infrastructure question starts to impinge very much, not just on Amazonian forests, but on the kinds of forests that are particularly strong emitters and that are very lousy in terms of their resilience. So this is just a quick slide over the carbon thing. Not only do you get a pulse, but, and I'm going to finish up soon, not only do you get a pulse, but also you get a foregone removal of forest carbon. So, so this becomes a problem, and I'm not going to explain this more because it goes into some detail. But here also is what you see are these white sand ecosystems. That's the Rio Negro area. And this, of course, is part of the Manaus-Mantua development corridor. And these are areas that are kind of I'm going to have to, I didn't realize, where's my phone? I usually have it sitting right here. It's potential spam. Hold on. Excuse me, I'm sorry about that. In any case, these are a sort of tenurial free-for-all, and so the dynamic of clearing for claiming is likely to be extremely severe in this kind of thing. These non-allocated tenurial regimes, you can see this here. Again, this is where the Manaus-Mantua road goes. There's a bunch of other roads that are going to be going in here. So this is actually an area of quite a bit of concern, particularly in light of the form of deforestation, which is going to be unproductive. And these landscapes are some of the worst soils in the world. And here's, of course, the large-scale infrastructure thing here. And what you can see is that, I won't go into it, but it gives you a sense of, one, the number of dams and other kinds of infrastructure that's going in all through these areas, port production, road production as well. The other issues are the China policy, climate change in the US and the variability in our production, of course. It gives the right, and that we're at the limit of our agricultural expansion in these kinds of commodities, opens the possibility of increasing the area for tropical grains and deforestation. I mentioned that we were talking about Amazonian ascendance from neo-extractive distributional things, perhaps to a much more oligarchic system right now. And this shift from public to private funding is to kind of lose levers of control. And also under COVID, we had almost no regulation, no implementation of existing regulations. So, and the other thing, and we're almost done here, which is this issue of financialization and the forms of financialization are important because there's a loss in the regulation, excuse me, over capital flows and accountability. So that if you're trying to, it's one thing if you can say, well, the Dutch are buying all the soy, then you can sort of put things in, you can pull some levers. However, if you're working through loans from tax havens, where there's no transparency at all, you have virtually no control over capital flows. And you can see that it's rather interesting that tax havens have become so important. And then finally, I'll just go over this again. No more demarcation of native indigenous lands. Indigenous and protected areas are under different kinds of management. This assimilationist policy, degazetting of conservation areas, amnesty for clear areas, rushing to regularize titles of cleared lands legally or not, environmental budgets, getting rid of the remote sensing directors, defunding of research areas, the drastic university cuts, knowledge system cuts from states of knowledge, which we could have argued was the technocratic state of Brazil before, and a long time approach in Brazil to the rule by social media and also the rule through corruption. There are alternatives. This happens to be acai, and I urge everybody to eat acai and Brazil nuts and any kind of socially produced product. But one of the things that you can see is that the value of these kinds of things is extremely high. It's in a forested area. I've shown you those pictures a couple of times compared to the value in deforested activities. And again, this is what a forested area looks like. I want you to remember this when you think about these large-scale landscape transformations. And as they say, Minerva's owls fly at dusk. So we'll know that what the last unfinished page of Genesis actually is. It's still open to question. We have two very powerful dynamics, one that keeps a rich forest standing and one which takes it away. So I'll end with that. And I'm sorry I've gone over time, but I'm going to stop share now and we open it up.
Thank you, Susanna. This was fascinating. I'm going to remove you from the spotlight for a second, okay. Invite our discussants. We have a number of people attending the event. This is part of the writing workshop, the Colloquium on Brazil grad writing workshop. So I have also some of my own grad students and undergrads attending the event. To all of you, if you would like to participate and send your questions or comments, you can use the Q&A, and Brian and I will collect your questions and redirect them to Susanna. But to help us get started and break the ice, I have invited two colleagues from the Spanish and Portuguese department whose research and writing do intersect with parts of your own presentation. Barbara Galindo is a PhD candidate in Spanish and Portuguese department, about to defend her dissertation. She specializes in Latin American literatures and cultures with a focus on Andean and Amazonian culture production. She lived in the Peruvian Amazon for 2 years, where she worked on a Cartonera project directed by French-American anthropologist Frédéric Apfel-Marglin in collaboration with the Ethnic Council of Quechua Youth in Amazonia, and as part of the international project Cultural Agents, directed by Professor Doris Sommer from Harvard University. She's currently writing her dissertation on the cultural representations of mining terror in the Andes from the end of the 19th century to the first half of the 20th century. And we also have Benjamin Burke, visiting assistant professor in Spanish and Portuguese and research fellow with the Center for Brazilian Studies. His research centers on Brazilian literature, cinema, and culture. He has defended a dissertation and written essays on utopia and dystopia in contemporary literary and cinematic representations of urban Brazil. In addition to utopia and dystopia in urban culture, he is interested in spatiality and national identity in Brazil since the early 20th century. The relationship between large urban centers across the Americas, particularly Sao Paulo and Mexico City, urban marginalities, and spatial syntax in Latin American audiovisual productions. So maybe we could start with our discussants, and each one of them could make a comment or pose one question, and then we would open up for other participants. In the meantime, if you have questions or comments, if you are attending this event, please submit them using our Q&A function or the chat box, and I'll make sure to send the question to Susanna. Thank you so much for participating. Maybe Barbara, maybe you could start.
Yes, thank you, Zé. Can you hear me well? So first of all, Susanna, that was a fascinating presentation, so complex and complete. And this is why it's very hard to have my first question is a little sad, so like giving up. It would be like regarding the future of the forest under a long Bolsonaro's regime. That would be my first concern. But I would also love to hear more about your research on Amazonian dark earth and among the Kayapos indigenous peoples.
Okay, one is if we have more of the same, more of Bolsonaro will have more of the same, because he will essentially, it's not clear what is going to happen because of course the situation with COVID in Brazil is so fantastically horrible right now. But as you probably saw, the deforestation numbers have been up in spite of COVID. So part of that is that people are desperate and will go work in clearing gangs, illegal forest extraction and gold mining. And this not just urban, they're not just rural people, but urban people. So it starts to be this thing which is absent any other kinds of alternatives that you could use. These become central things. I may have to lift my dog up and tell him to shut up, but so there's that. The other thing is that Amazonian dark earths have been kind of this transformative actually the Amazonian archaeology is with this exploding field right now, and there's so much work on the kinds of forests, the forms of domestication, the degree of manipulation of landscape, that it's gone from sort of, the empty land into a world that's deeply occupied. Well, one of the things that comes from that is, first of all, it helps you rewrite the history, not of just, the savage brute or noble savage, but as a history of a civilization. I mean, nobody tries to write the history, tries to imagine the history of the Middle East and, Iraq and Sumer without imagining that they had an agricultural base. So one of the things is that's very transformative. And the way it's transformative also that I think is important is that, first of all, it gives us a civilizational history in this region, which was sort of absent. The second thing is if we start to think about this, these are areas these are water worlds, and we'll be seeing a world full of a lot more flooding. So while I think the Terra, Preta and ADEs are really important, the ability to manage and be in aquatic systems is really important, if you will, gift from the tropics and gift from Amerindian civilizations, because they really know how to manage a lot of different forms of flooding, a lot of different forest resources that revolve around aquatics. So in a certain sense, while some parts of the world will be drying out, other parts of them will be getting a lot wetter. And so this can serve as, at least some of that knowledge is, helpful in terms of thinking about, what's coming down the pike with climate change for many places in the world. And also the tropics are expanding. I mean, what used to be considered the tropics is now, moving out. So as with global warming, we get more tropics. The other thing that I think is important to keep in mind is that many of the global commodities that are highly important and historically important, like rubber, you couldn't have had the Industrial Revolution without it. You couldn't have had imperialism without quinine, for good or for ill, but it's a major medicinal. You wouldn't have the sort of emergence of anesthesia without reserpine, which is, you know, the body poison curare. Manioc is the 8th most consumed carbohydrate, but if you think about it historically, manioc and sweet potatoes sort of changed the diet dynamics in Africa and also in Asia, particularly China, with sweet potatoes. And those are actually a part of this whole domestic thing. Chiles, you know, you might think chiles come from Mexico, but no. And then many people's favorite tree, which is cacao, of course, is a domesticated and wild grown. So one of the things is that there certainly is an extraordinary set of biotic resources that have been spearheaded into the world and really made the modern world in so many ways. And we don't know what the future world might be possible through some of these things. But you would really have to get, and I apologize for my dog, but Carlos Nobre also has a noisy dog, so I now no longer have much shame about my dog barking. But the other thing to think about in terms of this is we need to be thinking of the institutional thing that protects these resources and protects the rights to them and, if you will, the ability to monetize them. So if I grow Monsanto seeds, as many people do, I pay a royalty to them. And so somehow capturing the value of these to be able to use them within the Amazonian context, not just simply as using Amazonia as a storehouse of wealth to be squandered elsewhere, might be a very serious and interesting way to move these kinds of questions forward. So that's a long way from just ADE, because that's just one of the technologies. And also more sustainable tree-based systems based on trees and tubers may be our future. So
thank you, Susanna. And thank you, Barbara. Maybe Ben, I don't know if you'd have a question or a comment. I will switch.
Sure, certainly. Yeah, I also want to thank you so much for a really fascinating presentation that gave great insight into moments of hopefulness and, fortunately, growing kind of potential for despair in the Amazon. My question actually, I think, parallels Barbara's second question a bit. When you were speaking in the beginning about building ruins, and then also thinking about Amazonian archaeology and all of the terraforming and geoengineering that has taken place in the region, those are concepts that were fairly new to me and I found very interesting. And they also recalled the ideas of living with the trouble or living amongst the ruins among theorists of the Anthropocene in the environmental humanities, like Donna Haraway and Anna Singh, just to name a couple. So my question is, are there any cases of indigenous peoples or forest residents adapting to these changes, adapting the land or agricultural practices to recent deforestation or interference, or is it still too recent for that to have taken place?
I'm unmuted now. One of the things that I think is important to keep in mind here is that there's been a long process of creolization of indigenous and also Afro-descendant. I think people don't realize there's really a Black Amazon here too. Huge amounts, about 1 million, well, at least not 1 million, but in São Luís and Belém were rivals in terms of as slave ports in the late 18th century. So they have a long history, and they also have a revolutionary history. And if you think of that swath going from the Caribbean Amazon, which is the Guyanas, down through to close to Maranhão, basically to where the cataracts are, I sort of see that as being a Black Amazonia, in which you had a lot of creolization. It's now sort of, it's like this sort of considered mestizos and so on. But the point is that you had actually a lot of interaction both between the directorate world and the fleeing slaves, the quilombos, as areas of creolization, not only of race, and actually that Duffy marker, which gives resistance to malaria, becomes really important for interacting with this. And you probably know the great work on identification between some, in the Northeast, some communities describe themselves as being Afro-descendant and others indigenous, but they're the same, you know, they're like next to each other. So one of the things is there's been a lot of creolization, and these are active cultural areas. Second, remember that picture of the Kayapo at the Constitutional Convention. So many, and right now there's such extraordinary integration among all the indigenous groups in terms of political mobilizing. So one of the things is that they are basically becoming more powerful. The threats are making them more politically powerful. It's also important to remember that there are a lot of indigenous people who are living in cities or live in cities part-time. And within that, of course, they live in cities to use, get resources, to use computers and stuff like that. But the point is that you have a kind of urban indigeneity as well as a forest people's indigeneity. So there's more creolization, and there's more adaptation, and there's more interaction. I think that image of the native populations as semi-nomads lost in the forest, and then the forest Indians who don't want to be, who eschew contact, that primitiveness is, it's really hard to get out of your mind. But actually, of course, the picture that I showed you of Kayapo scientists, and I should have put some pictures of Kayapo women scientists on there, those are the same people that built all that complex infrastructure, that managed all of those things, that actually have a very well elaborated indigenous science. And the person I worked with the Kayapo, Daryl Posey, was very much always taught, he started the Kayapo project, which is how I got into all of the Terra Preta story, saying, there is just, tons of scientific knowledge here. I'm an entomologist. He was an entomologist. I'm channeling him. I need to get all sorts of experts to sit and come and decipher this knowledge. So part of the thing is that sometimes you need a translator from one set of systems of knowledge to the other. But also there have been a lot of parallel economies. You could think of the clandestine economies as essentially reliving parallel economies of the quilombos, the indigenous groups, and so on, that went on for so long. So there's that parallel economies, Creole economies, and then a sort of savvy way of using political and technological structures in order to advance the situation. But the power relations are still awful. And it's important to not keep that in mind. And that probably the most dangerous, it used to be people like to go and assassinate labor leaders, but that's sort of, now it's to really go after forest guardians and, indigenous environment protectors. So that's sort of, so I always think that living amongst the ruins has a little bit, and Daryl Haraway's, living with the trouble. Yes, one has to live with the trouble, but I find them a little more, it depends on which day, I find them a little depressing.
Thank you, Ben, for your question. We have a question, actually 2 questions from the audience. Can you read them?
Okay, one is from Elizabeth Landers. Hello, Elizabeth. Can you discuss the impact of forest destruction on indigenous aquatic subsistence practices? Well, one of the things is that river flows are changing. Regional microclimates are changing a lot. And also what I would say is that while deforestation is a problem, perhaps more serious is the use of glyphosate, which is the herbicide that goes with the soy complex. It's very toxic to fish. It's not, you know, people always say, well, it's not that poisonous to people, although Bayer, which is the producer of this, now it's Chinese company, it's Monsanto, Bayer now. And they're both Chinese companies. They're one Chinese company. When they went through their acquisition, they left several $1 billion aside to pay off lawsuits. So, but if you're not a big mammal like a person, but you're a fish or a smaller animal, and it's an herbicide, so you have a lot of impact on as they say, non-target species. So that's one thing. The second thing is this widespread prevalence of garimpos, of artisanal small-scale mining. And so what happens with that is there's a lot of mercury toxicity, that mercury that flows into the ecosystem, and it's very toxic. And it goes up the food chain, and so the fish then tend to be full of mercury. So it was quite lamentable the last time I was in Amazonia, and particularly in the Peruvian Amazon, where there's a lot of artisanal mining, where you just couldn't eat the river fish anymore, and they're so delectable, you know, your heart sort of breaks. But anyway, so there's that. The other thing is there's also big mining. There's bauxite mining, there's these big commercial legal mining systems, but they have holding dams and dams, and those are also quite toxic with secondary heavy metals of many kinds. So one of the things is that it may not be deforestation per se that's changing the impact of indigenous practices. Another thing, of course, is, you know, the widespread use of dams that completely changes the river flow. And there are hundreds of them on the books, getting ready to go forward. So there's a lot of questions. So I would not say that deforestation per se is so necessarily the issue with water, but rather the sort of widespread new set of traumas, if you will, that is now hitting the waterways.
Thank you, Elizabeth, for the question. Thank you, Susanna. We have two more, one comment and one question, actually. Sure. One question about the sources and recommendations, and a second question about the Chinese capital. Okay. And maybe we can wrap up with these two. I'll let you decide in which order.
Okay, the question, why don't we start with the question of Chinese capital and then end up with the sources?
Perfect.
What is I can't see the question.
I'm sorry, I'll read them. So the question is, could you share your thoughts on the expansion of Chinese capital on the Amazon? By Norélie Narvaez.
Yeah, thank you for that question. Actually, what you see is a lot of investment in the infrastructure, less so in the production side of it, although there is some. As I mentioned, Monsanto and Bayer are now Chinese corporations. So we could argue that these Chinese, they're quite dominant in the Amazonian soy complex. Also, China is very dominant in timber, in the timber market. About half the gold in the world right now that exists is from Amazonia. So if you like gold jewelry, you have a connection to Amazonia. So there are those commodities, and those three commodities in particular. Also the question of beef, and increasingly the question of fish. So but the Chinese dominance as the major trading partner works mainly through the financial sector and less on the production side. So they finance infrastructure. They'll do some debt relief, as in the case of Ecuador, in which they exchange debt relief and development funds and take it in oil. So there's a lot of different kinds of strategies at play, and it also depends on where you are and which kind of allies you have. They're very active in the timber acquisition things, and of course dominate the soy trade. So the issue I think about China is, of course, when asked once about the Iranians, they said, oh, well, we knew them when they were called the Persians. That they have a longer view of how you interact in these contexts. And I don't in any way see that their role will be diminished over time. The US has not, since it's been so engaged in the Middle East, has not sort of after the Cold War just sort of, packed up shop in a lot of ways, and left it as the Cold War being over, saw not much reason to continue funding or engaging to the same degree that it had. That terrain was picked up in part by philanthropic agencies and the EU, mainly around things like conservation and alternative conservation, as well as sort of telecommunications and so on. But the dynamics of the Chinese have been really active since 1990. So since the opening of this, of the neoliberal period, and it's been one of the drivers for extraction because it's such a phenomenally huge and active market. And also as you have the sort of rising of middle class tastes everywhere, the demand for meat is high. And as one person put it in Santarém, feeding Chinese pigs is not our liberation. So there's that. So the question of China is it will continue. And it's not even Bolsonaro's resistance to China for autarkic reasons. The importance of the Chinese market to the Brazilian economy is so profound, and to the Amazonian economies in general is so profound that there's almost there's no alternative at this moment. The second question was on sources. I'm not sure what
that's correct. I can read it for you. I sent you as a separate message. So the question is simple. We learned from Nilsa, we learned much from this presentation. Thank you. But for some of us, this information might not be very familiar. Which sources or readings would be a good starter to learn and have a more proactive and informed standpoint?
Well, I can give you some recent sources. I'll let you know that one thing that's going on right now is a kind of what's called the Scientific Panel for the Amazon, which is like the IPCC, except for, what we might call the Amazon emergency. That won't be out, but it will come out with sort of executive summaries, really probably within the next month. So I can post that with Jose and with the Latin American Institute. For general background about the development of this, of course, Fate of the Forest, never been out of print, is one place to start, and it gives you a sense of the authoritarian period. Right now, I have a paper in Current History that talks really about the Bolsonaro administration and the contemporary forest policy stuff that's going on right now. And I can send a copy of that to Jose to post. There's been a kind of dispersion of knowledge. The work on, there are two people who I think are just superior on the archaeology of Amazonia, and one is Jose Uriarte, or Iriarte. I'll send you the names on that. One is for 4,500 years of Amazonian agroforestry. And then there is some work by Eduardo Neves, which works on also this deeper history. It depends on, both of these are in English, they're scientific papers. So this isn't just somebody who's, imagining. These are not just people who are imagining things. There's some work by Denise. There's some compendia on the archaeology that are pretty good. And then, but right now, actually, there's just been a kind of dispersion. And the reality is also, as people have gotten more technology for remote sensing, there's less grounded field work than there used to be, which I think is really a shame, because it's that grounded field work that was so generative of so many of these ideas. But so I just went through what I find. What you see now is a lot of modeling exercises. We know much more about the carbon dynamics of Amazonia than we do about the human dynamics. But there's a couple of good places to look for contemporary stuff. One would be something like the journal World Development, which looks at these sort of environmental questions and international development. And they run a few articles every year on Amazonia, and it's an excellent journal. In terms of a lot of other things, I would say something like the Journal of Peasant Studies does a lot of work on land use change and the dynamics, the social dynamics of land use change. And then something like Bioscience looks at some of the social relations of this. But the problem that we have, and why I feel inclined to write another book, is what one needs right now is a good compendium that takes us from, that integrates the really extraordinary transformations in the archaeology and ethnography and what that means for Amazonian ecologies. And then this whole thing about this new forms of nation building and the meaning of Amazonia in nation building. A lot of political scientists just talk about that, and they don't talk about the relationship of this to environment. And then the contemporary Bolsonaro phase, which we hope doesn't go on forever. I mean, not just for the Amazonia's sake, but for the sake of the Brazilian people who are really suffering under COVID. So, so those are some of the things that I would like to recommend. What we can do, though, is I can give you a little bit of a. I actually had a kind of meltdown of my EndNote, but in a few days I can certainly give you a little compendium along topic areas that might be quite useful for this, of some really good research, and that's accessible. It doesn't, it's not so technified that you have to sort of sit and work through the remote sensing equations. Another really good source that's a journalistic source is Mongabay. Mongabay, and they cover a lot of environmental things globally in the tropics. So they're kind of great.
Thank you, Susanna. And thank you, Nilsa, for the question. As I mentioned at the beginning, this is part of the Colloquium on Brazil and the Brazil Granite Writing Workshop that I'm currently teaching. So students are participating. I would be happy, Susanna, to share any resources, any PDFs, your own articles and the bibliography you just referred to with my students and all the other participants. We have had a wonderful discussion, and thank you so much, Susanna, for your generosity, for your participation. I will ask Benjamin to make a short announcement about our upcoming Brazilian film series event, because it is directly related to your talk. And maybe Brian can say a couple of words about our COVID-19 and Bolsonaro event coming up in late May. And thank you, all of you, for participating and watching the presentation today. So, Ben?
Yes, so our spring entry in the long-running Brazilian film series will be a documentary called Amazônia, o Despertar da Florestânia, Dawn of Florestânia. So that I'm hoping to finalize everything for a debut 2 weeks from today, and the film will be available to stream for 2 weeks. And I am also working on having a live Q&A conversation with the co-directors, Miguel Prezdovosky and Cristiani Torloni. So please stay
Great.
tuned to the Latin American Institute calendar and the Portuguese@UCLA.com website for updates on that. And I hope to see some of you there.
And then in addition, on Tuesday, May 25th at 1 p.m. Pacific time, we're going to be holding a second webinar, a follow-up to one that we did 1 year ago on the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on Brazil. As many of you may know, Brazil has now become the global epicenter of the pandemic. Several days over the last couple of weeks, Brazil has had more deaths from COVID-19 than the next 10 countries combined.
Wow.
And the entire time, the president of Brazil continues to say that it's not a big deal and to resist lockdown measures and do everything he can to reverse lockdown measures that state governors have imposed in the absence of federal leadership. We're going to be bringing back the same 3 panelists as we had last year. Karen Nielsen from from the UCLA Medical School, Brian Meir, who is the Brazil correspondent for Telesur and co-editor of the Brazilian news website Brazil Wire, and also Maria Amelia Veras, who is from the Department of Collective Health at the Santa Casa de São Paulo. And so we'll have information on that on our website shortly and on Facebook as well.
It was great. The last one was fantastic, by the way. So I urge everybody who's on it, who's still on, to go and listen to it. It was marvelous and really informative. And now I'm sure it will be equally as good and perhaps more relevant given Brazil's horrible situation.
I would also like to take this opportunity to thank Brian Pitts for helping me out today, as always, with all the events, including the COVID-19, which is coming up. It's not easy to manage these webinars with the cameras or the spotlights, the chat box, the Q&A, the Facebook Live, the recording of the event. So Brian has been immensely helpful. Thank you also, Barbara Galindo and Benjamin Burt, for participating, for your questions and comments. This has been extremely interesting to me, and I hope this becomes the first of many, or perhaps a series of events bringing together senior faculty, senior researchers, and new aspiring Brazilianists in different fields. So this was the goal today, to bring together urban humanities and urban planning, environmental studies, and political activism, bridging, I think, the gap between North, South, East, and West campus. So thank you all for participating. And once again, Susanna, I'm a big fan. Thank you again for being here today and entertaining my students and the guests. I'm hoping that we're going to have this posted on our website, the Center for Brazilian Studies and the Portuguese@UCLA websites very soon.
Great. Well, thank you also for the invitation. Truly, it was my pleasure. It's so great to see you guys. And it's been so hard to maintain a kind of collective and intellectual life in this time. So these efforts are especially, they're always appreciated, but especially now.
We appreciate your visit, your contribution, and your research.